All right, so here we are with my old 1987 land barge. It's had many uses over the time that I've had it in the last few years. Camper rig. It's a G20 model, so it works really good for hooking up car trailers too and pulling those along. And just overall, it's a tremendous utility vehicle. Really nice unit. I only paid about $1,500 for it, and it's just been super handy to have around. But anyway, the ball joints have started to go out, at least the lower ball joint here on the passenger side. So today I want to go through just the process of swapping out that lower ball joint and just getting everything straight on this Chevy van again, so I can take it camping, and be just fine and not have to worry about it when I'm out in the Smoky Mountains or something crazy like that. So just briefly, some of the things you're going to want to have is obviously a jack, which I have under there, and that's how I found that my ball joint was bad. Some jack stands for safety's sake. You're going to want a ball joint press, a coil spring compressor, pickle fork deal, or a ball joint separator as they have it labeled there, some sockets, a breaker bar, and just some other miscellaneous tools. But those are the main tools that you're going to want to rent. I got these from O'Reilly's. Obviously, when we're done, we're going to take them back, and then we'll be good to go. So anyway, let's dive into this thing and get this fixed. All right, so we got the wheel up in the air here, and we're just going to pull on this back and forth, and you can see the play in that ball joint, and you can hear it as well, but we're able to do this by hand. Usually you need a pry bar, so these are pretty much toast. And the reason I went ahead and looked at it is when I was going down the highway there, it just seemed a little squirrely, almost like we had an alignment issue, and it just seemed to get worse within the last month, and jacking it up, and here we go. Obviously we got a pretty good problem. Which in severe cases, what you can have happen is that ball joint completely separate, and that would be not very ideal, having that wheel come up in the fender and probably put us in the ditch. So anyway, makes good sense to replace this. All right, so now we got the van up in the air. I jacked up in the center because we're going to be working around this area and hooking in our spring compressor. Plus, when we break this ball joint, we want to be able to use that spring pressure to help pull it apart initially. So we have everything kind of out of the way. I threw a couple of jack stands in here just because I'm going to be working on this side of the vehicle, and I want to be safe so I don't have to worry about anything falling on top of me. So now we got our 13/16 socket here. It's not an impact socket, so it's thin enough to get in here on these custom wheels. But anyway, we're going to just break these free. Now normally you could do this when the vehicle's on the ground with a breaker bar, but either way works out usually. All right, so you want to keep your lug nuts in a safe place away from your work area, because naturally you're always going to kick those under something and never find them again. Kind of like a 10mm socket. But anyway, we got our wheel off. Sometimes if these have been on for a long time, they're seized on. Usually give it a good kick and they'll come right off if that's the case. And now we can get to our ball joint. All right, so we got a few things going on here that are going to stop us from lowering our bottom control arm and whatnot. So first thing is our torsion bar on this van. We're going to zip that loose so we don't destroy all of our rubber on that guy. And the other thing that's attached to our bottom control arm here is this old shock, which is probably the original one. So we're going to go ahead and get that zipped off, which is probably going to be fun if you live in the Midwest like I do, where it's Rustville, USA. All these threads are going to be all gacked up, and it's going to be quite a chore. So we might end up having to cut those off with a grinder. I'm not sure yet, but we'll just see what happens. Ooh, that's a victory. Bottom one's really nice and rotty. These electric impacts are awful handy. Can you believe we worked for years without having these? We just used breaker bars. So our ever handy impact here, we're gonna hook on here and just zip that guy the rest of the way out of there. And then, there we go. Oh, there's still some shock life left in that. It's always one ends up being a ton of fun. There we go. Oh, that was too easy. There you go. Done. All right, so this torsion bar is kind of a son of a gun here, but if you get under it with an impact and you hold the top of the wrench there pretty tight, watch your hand. I'm not sure what that torsion bar is going to do, so be careful. But then we can get this stuff broke free and get this torsion bar out of here and not mess it up when we drop that control arm down. You got that one good. And I can't express just how important having an impact is here, especially if you live in Rustville like we, where instead of having to rip this apart with wrenches, you can just run everything off. It saves half the time for real. There it is. Galled up threads are no match. Now the next thing we need to do here is break our castle nut free, but before we can do that, we got a little cotter pin in here, as you can see, that's probably been in here since 1987. It's pretty rotted in place, but a pair of needle nose and a flathead usually go a long way here to getting that thing weaseled out. All right, so after an immense amount of cussing off screen, finally we're able to get this cotter pin out after splitting it in half and pulling one side out one way and one side out the other. We got her out. So who knew that would be the hardest part of this process thus far? All right, so now we're going to break our nut free. We're going to spray a little bit of PB Blaster on it to hopefully lubricate that guy, seeing as how rusted up that was. And I guess get a breaker bar on it and see if we can get it loose. All right, so what we got here is the impact, a swivel, and a 1 1/16 impact socket here. And this is pretty bad angle, but if you try and use a breaker bar, what you're going to end up doing is it's going to turn your whole spindle assembly, and then if you leave your steering lock on, you're just wrenching against your steering parts, which I really don't like to do. So this is kind of hard on our swivel, but if we can get in here just right, we should be able to break this guy free. And that's looking pretty good. So at this point, we got it broke free and we can't see exactly what we're doing, and this can get pretty dangerous because now we're under our spring pressure. So at this point, I'm going to go and move our jack up under our control arm, and we're going to get our spring compressor all set up. So now we got our frame all blocked up here. I threw a couple of extra jack stands down here just for safety on top of that. Obviously, I hope that we don't come down on our control arm on that jack stand, but just in case, you know, I'd rather have that happen than the thing fall on me, and we're holding our vehicle up on the other side. So now, this is the redneck portion of our show where the spring compressor actually did not fit in this Chevy van. So now what I went ahead and did is I ran a chain up through the center and then through some coils and then just bolted it with some slack on the back side, and that'll just help contain it from, I guess, being a bomb when we break this castle nut. We'll have to see how that goes back together in this orientation of a spring compressor, but I'm confident that we can figure that one out without much issue. So anyway, now at this point we're going to break our nut free and run it most of the way up the stud, but not all the way off, and I'm sure we'll have to use our pickle fork. But right now I do not have the jack contacting the control arm, because when we hit it with the our separator fork there, hopefully we can use the spring to our advantage and use some of that pressure to help split that ball joint. All right, so one thing that I forgot to mention here, it helps a lot to have your key in the ignition. Obviously not turned to ignition, but enough to break your steering lock so you can rotate your rotor. So now we got our 1 1/16 impact socket on here, our swivel with a little extension going around the inside of the brake line. And now I just ran our jack up a little bit here so that we can go ahead and just run this nut all the way off, and then we'll put it back on a few threads before we break our ball joint. But now, hopefully, and this is a pretty aggressive angle on this swivel, but looks like it's working out. Perfect. Good and free. So now we'll put her back on here. I hit this with PB Blaster beforehand just to loosen it up. So we want to maintain a good amount of thread so we don't just blow those apart. So now we got that on. We're going to relieve some of our jack pressure, maybe. Run that back up. So now our jack is right under our control arm, but we can still use our spring pressure here to break this ball joint. So we're going to get our pickle fork and get after it. Alright, so now we got our pickle fork. We're going to shove it right in under here on top of our ball joint, and of course it's going to destroy the rubber, but hopefully once we get this started in here, it'll separate that ball joint. Boom, there we go. And with that, our ball joint's free. So now we're going to come right up under here, under our control arm, jack this back up. Maybe we can, now our nut's going to be pretty tight because we're working against our spring pressure. Here we go. Relieve that so that now we can twist that off. Now we got our castle nut off, and now we're just going to hope that our chain works and holds our spring together. So I'm going to let our jack down nice and slow. That ball joint's going to separate. Alright, so now we were catching on our little dust cover on our brake rotor here, so this is going to be really interesting. I'm going to hold this out of the way. I'm going to let this spring down nice and slow. There we go. Now we're past it. We stop the jack. We can get to a safe distance away from this grenade. Never tried this chain deal before, so that's new to me. And now, I think we're still hanging up on that guy right there. Not really. I think it's actually free. And there we go. Yep, it's definitely loose. Perfect. Nobody died. That spring's good and loose. Awesome. All right, so as it turns out, that spring is really pretty loose in there, and probably didn't need a spring compressor at all. So that's pretty handy on this vehicle. Now you're going to want to hold this spindle and upper control arm assembly here up and out of the way, and you could either tie it up to the frame, or I just ran a wedge down in here with a piece of sheet metal, or you could use naturally a 2x4, whatever you have laying around. But now we have our ball joint exposed, and we can get our press on it and pop that guy right on out of there. Alright, so this got pretty interesting here, trying to figure out how to hook all this up. But basically the way the ball joint goes in is it pushes in from the bottom. So your ball joint tool has these receiving tubes here, and it needs to go around the outside of the ball joint. So in this case, it's this larger unit. Now the ball joint tool comes with these two cups, and one of them seats nicely into the top part of our ball joint tool, and that allows for our ball joint right here to go through, but that cup has a little ridge in it that helps it be retained in the top of our ball joint tool, so everything works straight as we tighten it up. And it is counterintuitive with this being on the bottom, but what's going on here is as you tighten this up, this is on the outside of the ball joint, and it's pulling the ball joint down through. As you can see, that little cup is making contact with the ball joint, and as I tighten it up, it's going to forcibly push that through. So we had to get enough clearance here for this to fit, and what I did is I pushed my jack in here and just pushed my control arm up a little bit, compressing my spring again, And again, we have it safety chained, so if it did pop out, it's not going anywhere too far. Now, another thing here that was pretty annoying is this upper control arm, and our caliper unit wants to fall down into where you're working, but I threw a piece of steel tubing up in here where I pivoted off of our spring perch and off of the spindle assembly here itself, and that holds it out of the way nice. As you can see, it's braced here so it can't drop down in our way. And now we can just keep tightening this away, and I've been using this other piece of steel here as my breaker bar, and eventually this guy is going to pop right on out of here. And that's it. Receiving tube. See if we actually received anything. Oh, there we go. And there's the ball joint, and with working straight down through the center of that, and went right down, and we didn't mess up our stamping whatsoever. And that's that. Time to put the new ball joint in. All right, so now that we have this out, I just want to give a better look at how exactly I set this up. So our threaded piece obviously was pointed at the ground, as you saw, and that allowed for our top, or I guess our bottom little washer unit to accept this guy here, which made contact with the actual control arm itself, where it allowed our ball joint to slip in. Now, this kit came with several of these units. I would assume you want to use the unit that's just barely bigger than your ball joint. Now, if you could have used this one, it would have made no sense at all to use this guy. The smaller you can get in closer to this size, you can get, the more centered up it's going to be. So only one of these goes onto the top of our driver tool here, and or I guess our press, or whatever you want to call it. So this allowed to somewhat run true down through the center of our ball joint, where it could push it right on down through and out. So that's kind of the setup we had there, and worked pretty well.